Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We are excited to have you here. Our topic today is the shifting landscape of identity access governance, a roundtable discussion by top field experts. Our presenters will introduce themselves in just a moment, but I just have a few housekeeping items to go through before we get to their introductions. We are offering CPE credits for this webinar. So if you would like to enter your information, you can enter that at the end of this presentation. We just require that you stay for the majority of the presentation, and then you can fill out the form that will pop up at the end. And with that, I will go to the introduction of our speakers. Our first speaker is Jason Gzym, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's a pleasure being here today, talking about this topic that I know all three of us are very passionate about, experienced. A little bit about myself. I grew up a practitioner from the IT side. So directories, authentication, user ID passwords, Novell, for those who are aware of what that is, 20-something years ago. And then, through my journey in that, it's the authentication, single sign-on occurred, but, LDAP group management, LDAP access to applications, and then identity management, the automation of that. So coming from a practitioner background, always looking at the automation for cost operational savings. But through my journey in the program of the different silos that live within identity security and access governance, came across, the business value. What does it really mean from a business standpoint? What are the business outcomes that you want to get from application governance and the critical applications that are financially significant, right? So love sharing knowledge. That's why we're here today. And I'll turn it over to James.
Great. Thank you, Jason. My name is James Roeske. I'm the CEO of the Customer Advisory Group. A little bit about me and my background. I've been in the industry now for a little over 30 years related to GRC, compliance, audit, security, specializing in SAP, as well as just generally helping customers get through the challenge of compliance and access. Over those many years that I've spent in the industry, I've seen a lot of change. I've also had to change some of my opinions and approaches when it comes to compliance and security. And as I always like to say, I've been there, done that, and bought the t-shirt. Long story short is I'd like to also, as Jason mentioned, impart some of my experience and insight and give you some background and real life experiences. I'm very focused on the reality. I always cringe when I hear, well, that's best practice. Well, it might be best practice for you, but it might not work for another customer. So basically summarizing some of my experience and interaction with customers around the world over my years and when it comes to security and compliance. So with that said, I'll pass it to Jamie Frame.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, Jason, and James. My name's Jamie Frame. I'm a partner and COO at the Customer Advisory Group. I've been in the information security, risk management, and audit field for over 25 years. I've spent some time with some of the larger companies on the planet and the Fortune 50 and many, many smaller businesses as we built the Customer Advisory Group. My responsibilities with CAG are with our strategic customers, oversee the marketing and business development aspects, but also participating in customer advisory projects where we bring together the identity, the Sarbanes-Oxley, the role management, and the sustainability of the systems to support the customer base. So thank you. I really enjoy this topic and looking forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you for those introductions. We're going to go into our discussion today. I just wanted to note that there is a Q&A box that you can put questions into, and we encourage you to do that. We'll also have a Q&A session at the very end of this presentation where we can answer questions. And with that, we'll proceed with the presentation. So our first topic is user identity and authentication, the first line of defense. What's the nature of material weaknesses and how has that increased in the last few years?
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so if you think about that first line of defense, that's kind of where I got my start, as I was saying earlier, that evolution of authentication with local authentication applications. As those started, evolving, you had LDAP and directories, then web-based applications came along. You had single sign-on, you have SAML and OIDC, MFA. And, what you hear a lot in the authentication world today is this evolution into continuous authentication, looking at biometrics of the device you're on to whether or not the session should still be active, right? So that's continuous monitoring of the authentication in the session as to whether or not somebody should still have that session. There's also the OpenID Foundation's, shared signals working group. You might hear of continuous access evaluation protocol or the risk incident sharing coordination or risk. So these are all evolution of authentication, securing your front door so that only the right people have access to gain access into your application portfolio. But what I want to take, that's the IT, that's the CIO, kind of looking at the front door. What I want to concentrate on and get some of the opinions and real world examples from James and Jamie is, how does that apply to the authorization, the auth Z layers? Maybe zero standing privilege isn't always technically possible with some applications. Maybe you have to use things like privileged access management and vaulting, or maybe it's elevation, time-bound access. But take those same principles that's really a hot topic in the front door of continuous authentication and monitoring, and apply that to the authorization layer inside some of the most critical applications like SAP, Oracle, Workday, and PeopleSoft. So James and Jamie, what have you seen as an evolution as far as the authorization world is concerned, as you see it with a continuous, try to get as close to real time as possible so that that risk is known sooner rather than later?
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. Well, I've spent my entire career past that front door, as you put it. I love that analogy, is that once you step in, that's really where my security world and experience is always focused on, because in my humble opinion, that's where the complexity lies. And we're going to talk more about complexity. It's about making sure that once that person has authenticated, making sure they have the right access to do their job, nothing more and nothing less. Now that sounds easy on the surface, but it's not as easy as people think when it comes to mapping business processes, as well as identifying risk tolerances, segregation of duties, critical access, all those things that you alluded to. And having that granularity is absolutely essential. In my introduction, I kind of alluded to how I've had to kind of change my philosophies over the years when it came to security. Back in the old days, when I first started, authentication was really so-called, quote, security, right? And everything after that was kind of a free-for-all, because once you passed the so-called security check, you were in. And a lot of organizations didn't spend the time on that granularity because it was hard and difficult and not necessarily thought of as being a priority back then. Well, times have changed, right? You can't just have one front door. You have to have multiple levels of access, multiple levels of checks and security once you pass that authentication stage. And investing and worrying about it and building that granularity is absolutely essential, because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, making sure people have the right access to do their job, nothing more and nothing less, is not only essential for good business practices, but also for audit requirements and risk mitigation, for sure.
And Jason, I would add to that, we're going to talk a little bit more about ownership and the people, process, and technology in the throughout this discussion. But I think we need to talk about why are we doing this when we go to a customer? And from a long time ago, we're hearing the business and IT teams have responsibilities. Well, those responsibilities are shifting, and we're not doing this type of investment just to placate a particular group or placate auditors, internal or external. We're doing it because it's smart business practice. And we're doing it because it creates efficiencies in utilizing your resources, people and systems. But It's really helping everyone in the organization that has a role and responsibility understand what are the right things to be doing. So we spend a lot of time with our customer base talking about that, educating them about that, and just not, putting a rubber stamp on something. It's understanding it throughout its process.
And to dovetail off of what Jamie mentioned is that, the landscapes are becoming more complex nowadays as well. We have multiple applications, critical applications within organizations, multiple platforms, not even just, multiple same applications. And there needs to be granularity within each one of those. Plus, we now need to worry about all those systems interacting with each other, working together, and potentially having people with access across those landscapes that may be able to do one thing over here and through another thing in this other system. And if those systems are talking together, be able to raise risk for that organization. So having that broad view of that granularity, I know that's kind of an ironic statement, but a broad view of granularity is absolutely important. And that level of complexity is becoming so difficult. You need to have the right tools. You need to have the right applications, the right focus to be able to do that. Otherwise, to Jamie's point before, you can really spin your wheels. Nowadays, organizations are needing to do more with less. Security teams, unfortunately, are being asked to shrink or take on more activities rather than bringing on more resources, et cetera. And that efficiency is absolutely important. And it isn't about ignoring it and not doing the necessary granularity in the security to be able to do things within your budget, but it's about working smarter rather than harder. And I think that's what Jamie was getting at for sure.
Yeah, when you look at material weakness, I think the definition's always been the same. At least it has been for United States and the SEC. But what have you seen in the evolution of regulations that would give businesses pause to think about investing more in this granularity of their financially critical applications, and not just who has access to what within them, but what are they doing within those applications? So how have you seen regulations on the front lines affecting the need for this, and not just for the public sector, but also or the publicly traded companies, but also worldwide?
Yeah, great question. I think the regulations have been critical for moving that needle for security priority within organizations. It's unfortunate that it takes a stipulation or a requirement to be able to have people truly focus the efforts in security and potentially budgets, but it has been essential. Of course, we've had a lot of big frauds over the years, and we're still seeing a lot in the news. I always cringe picking up, you don't really pick up a newspaper, but when you read online nowadays of some of the major internal frauds that are occurring, it's scary. The primary thing for me is that fraud is not new, okay? Fraud has been happening from the very beginning of time. One thing that I think has changed is not only the regulatory requirements, but the key things in those regulatory requirements of now you can't hide stuff, right? Back in the old days when I started, if there was a material weakness, it was known, they didn't want to address it, or if they actually had a fraud that took advantage of that material weakness, it was usually kept hush-hush and internal. A lot of organizations sometimes made the calculations to say, is it cheaper to fix the problem, or is it cheaper to address if the problem were to actually occur? And that's very, very unfortunate. And I think a lot of the regulatory items have really brought that to light and made people understand that, hey, it's not the actual material weakness, but there's a lot of things that can come along with a fraud, right? It's also impact to your branding. It's if your name as an organization hits the newspapers, we are now, organizations are laying criminal charges, et cetera, compared to, hey, let's just keep it internal. Now, regulatory items have been evolving over the years. One of the reasons why some of these original applications that I worked on started was because of Sarbanes-Oxley, et cetera. but we're kind of seeing the proliferation of so many different additional regulatory requirements, including, industry specific, et cetera, like you were alluding to, Jason. It's becoming challenging, I believe, for customers, because things are always evolving from a regulatory perspective. Audit requirements are always evolving. And, a lot of organizations who are not focusing with the right tools, right resources, et cetera, on this are always one step behind. So they become reactionary, right? We have an audit, something was brought up, now we need to fix it. And one of the things that we specialize at CAG, and we advocate to every customer, is that getting one step ahead of these regulations, getting one step ahead of whoever's enforcing these regulations within your organization, either internal, external, et cetera, is absolutely essential. Otherwise, you're just going to be playing firefighter forever. And it's always going to be a surprise and a nasty thing when a report comes out.
Well, I think we, have an idea of what the different lines of defenses are. Any good cybersecurity program has all these different types of defenses. One thing that when I started my career, I was always patching servers, right? But one thing that's kind of come up in this web-based world is, application security posture as well. I can have the best controls in place from a user access standpoint, but if my application is misconfigured against best security practices, because my password policy might be too weak, et cetera, where have you seen, has there been an uptick or a downtick? And from a geographical perspective as well, where do you see your clients concentrating on making sure that their critical applications have the right cyber controls for those applications applied as well?
Yeah. Jamie, do you want this one, or shall I take it?
Go ahead, start, James.
Yeah, sure. Really, from a cyber perspective, it's keeping things up to date. Jason, I know you refer to of what you had to do in the past, but that topic will never go out of style, especially because the frequencies of patches and things are coming out hot and heavy, which I think is a good thing. But it's very easy for an organization to fall behind. One thing that we really emphasize to customers is consistency, making sure that you're doing it across landscapes. Now, I referred to previous that landscapes are getting bigger, more complex and more diverse. And a simple thing like making sure that everything is patched to a certain level is a lot harder than even back in the old days, right? Because you have that extra level of frequency. We still run into organizations and companies that only do patches once per year, believe it or not, and it just makes me cringe. And a simple thing like focusing on a policy to change that is important. Now, with that said, you can be fully up to date on your patches and still have a very poor security model behind the scenes, right? And they need to go hand in hand. It isn't just about we're doing one thing so we're good. It's looking across the board and looking holistically. And that's part of that message of consistency that I mentioned before as well. And this is hard. And it's easy for a consultant like myself to pontificate of you need to do this, but it's also putting together rational, realistic plans and frequencies and having resources to pay attention to it, as well as having management organizations and even business people participate to the level for testing and validation, et cetera. And that's where that complexity and effort comes into play. It isn't just, hey, we need to get the security person to go and do the patches. It's about, it takes a village putting them all together. And that's where a lot of organizations struggle still.
Right. And Jason, that's where we come in. And I think it really leads into the other part of your question, which is what are we seeing? But, with customers, it's where we come in is we identify what their state of their environment is. And if we look at it from more of a compliance maturity model, we try to start with an assessment of where they are with their environment. What tools do they currently have? What people do they have in place? What processes do they have in place? And then we look at, really identifying gaps around that. As James mentioned, teams are thin and business resources are overworked and have very little capacity. So what we try to do is go in and identify those gaps, look at what technology they need to be either they have already or they need to be put in place to expand to comply with their controls. But this is looking at internal and external threat. But this leads to ensuring the right ownership is there, including the point of monitoring. What CAG does then is builds a technology roadmap. We basically leave that with the leadership team to review and make decisions on where to focus first. But we laid that plan out, which includes software selection. It could be software expansion, remediation, and then what resources are required from the business and the IT side, audit included there, and then a timeline. But it's extremely important for us to, as companies are expanding, is to get their foundation set. And sometimes it has to be reset from the most simple things. What are the people focused on? We need to get the right technology deployed. We need to have the right processes in place, but also very, very important to continue to monitor things, have a checkpoint in place to ensure that things are in line and in check, and the owners are clear on their role and responsibility in doing all of that.
Before we move on to additional challenges that you've witnessed, one question that I hear quite a bit is, why is it important to have the most granular view of these applications that are very hierarchical in nature? And so it's a pretty simple question, but why is it important to have the lowest layer of visibility inside these very complex security models for audit and control purposes? And we'll move on to challenges after that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, within modern applications, and I'll use SAP as an example, it just takes one single T code, and maybe not even a T code, but an authorization object and value to be able to open the door of having someone really going from something harmless like display to something that could be very, very critical and impactful to your system if it was used for evil rather than good. And if you're only monitoring at a high level at 10,000 feet, or your applications and tools that you have for security monitoring are only looking at a high level, it's very, very simple to miss that level of granularity and impact to understand where your risk is, all the way down to the authorization object and value level. And I'm, of course, using an SAP example, but that then ripples out to every other application as well. Every diverse security thing, it just takes one little checkbox, one little menu, one little what have you, depending on the platform that you're talking about, that can turn a user's access from something very, very harmless to something that is riskful for the organization. Having the right tools to be able to analyze that, and also having the wherewithal within your security organization to understand that granularity, understand that risk, and be able to look for the right things that pose that risk are absolutely, absolutely critical. Now, back to that security granularity, if your security roles, hypothetically, or the bundles of access that you assign to people are also built at that high level where you have wide sweeping values. Once again, to use an SAP example, if you have stars and values here and there and wide open org values, etc., that is also a discredit to yourself, because those risks can be there and not even visible, hypothetically, if you don't have the witness, the wherewithal to witness it within your granular security. It's not odd for us to go into a new customer who really hasn't had a focus on segregation of duty or governance, risk, and compliance in the past. And we set up a tool such as Pathlock, we implement it, we put in a rule set, and we run reports, and we find out that there are potentially millions of risk items, SOD violations, critical access. And when people see these first reports, if they're new to the GRC concept, they're floored. They say, oh my goodness, we didn't know this. And, is that even true? And then we have to prove that, yes, it actually is true, because this one little T code or this one auth object, as the system reported, raises your risk, and it gives them the capability to do something that you maybe weren't aware that they could actually do. And relying on ignorance, and especially ignorance when it comes to your compliance, is no longer no longer a practice, let alone an acceptable practice. And that's why having not only that granularity, but also the tools to highlight that granularity, and Jason, to your point, prove that granularity to auditors is absolutely essential. So when the auditors do come in, hypothetically, and ask, how many people can create a purchase order? Back in the old days, that was a struggle. It was running multiple reports, building spreadsheets, all that great stuff, compared to working smarter rather than harder, and having an application such as Pathlock be able to run a report to say, these are all the people that can do this. And then more importantly, taking it one step further of granularity, these are all the people who have done this through the reporting, which is, absolutely essential. And when you say it real quick, like I did, it sounds like common sense, but believe it or not, that common sense didn't exist for a long, long time. And unfortunately, a lot of customers know the common sense, but sometimes don't have the capability to get to that level yet. And that's, of course, what we are having this presentation about, and also singing it from the rooftops to help those customers get to where they need to when it comes to granularity of not only security, but understanding that granularity, and most importantly, having the tools to be able to highlight, report on, and do all that great stuff as well.
And Jason, I would just add a couple quick points. Some customers cringe at the word granularity, and we try to soothe that to a degree, and what we like to lead with is the automation. While you're expanding, having a centralized system to manage these functions helps you focus on the right things, as James mentioned, but also the magnitude of the things that are being done. And I do think that the Pathlock software really displays that. What was done, what was the magnitude of what was done, and it helps people get refocused on looking at the right things.
Absolutely. As we move into additional challenges that we've already talked about today, and to your point, a high critical risk in one organization in the same vertical may be totally different than a competitor in the same vertical. That's why companies such as yourself that provide that bespoke rule set tweak, because you can always provide this out of the box rule set for segregation of duties and looking for risks, but somebody that understands the business such as yourself to help advise which risks are more important than others, understanding the granularity of the security model and other applications. So as we talk about the application portfolio has typically been monolithic. Either it's SAP or Oracle. Or lines of business, they have their own applications for supply chain and other lines of business, right? So it's not all in their one stack. And other challenges, not every application routes through the same authentication realm, and it may not have the same authorization, a security model. And if you look at GRC programs in the past, you can have a vendor lock-in, because why would one vendor's GRC solution want to help out their competitors' ERP systems, right? So we know there's some challenges in this area of GRC and the fine-grained entitlement for segregation of duties, but understanding that security models applications is really significant to ensure there's no false positives, because I know internal audit does not like chasing their tail to remediate false positives when there really is no risk there, right? So having a good view of what that risk is. What other challenges have you seen as organizations try to implement, this fine-grained visibility around regulated financially critical applications?
Yeah, great question, Jason. Usually diversity is the killer. We've kind of alluded to this already, but back in the old days, I used to hear customers say, "Hey, we're an SAP shop." That means we only do SAP. And as a result, when we talk about compliance solutions and security solutions, well, you needed one that supported SAP, and you were done, right? Because that's all their critical stuff was managed by a single or multiple SAP systems. Times have changed. And we were very fortunate, or we are very fortunate, that S4HANA, even R3, depending where you are on the SAP side, has a very granular, and I'm going to make people cringe, like Jamie said, I'll use that word again, granular security authorization concept, meaning that I have little switches here and there to be able to control a lot of different things, right? But times are different. Customers are saying, hey, we're not just an SAP shop, we're a best of breed shop, right? And if SAP, of course, is best of breed, we're going to go with it. But if there's another application that's better, let's bring that into our fold and have the two systems integrate, et cetera. And they're building that. Now, also with the rise to the cloud, no pun intended, cloud applications are bringing kind of I always call it the wild, wild west, because the new generation of applications don't necessarily follow the same type of model when it comes to authorizations. And from what I've seen with a lot of cloud applications is that they're usually less granular, meaning that they don't have as many switches that we can control. It's more of an all or nothing scenario when it comes to actions within the application. Now, that can be good or bad. It can be good from an ease of use from an end user perspective, but it can be bad from a security control perspective. And more importantly, building that big picture of both, an SAP granular environment with a cloud application that isn't granular, how they're talking to each other, how access for an individual across those two systems working together could cause risk is hard. And the last thing that I'll mention on kind of the hard side, and then we'll talk about the solution, is that a lot of security teams and compliance teams are focused on a single application, unfortunately. We have an SAP security team, and then we have a cloud team, and we have, you can name the full list. And although they're all kindred spirits when it comes to security and have the same goal of compliance, they are different teams under different management with different skill sets that don't necessarily work together and talk to each other. It's very rare that you go into an organization and they say, we have one security team, and this team handles every application under the sun with the exact same processes consistently. That is kind of the holy grail where we want to get to. Now, to paint that picture from a compliance application perspective, Jamie mentioned this, and I'll articulate again and then highlight what he said, is we really are looking for a one-stop shop, right? Not only a one-stop shop of one security team, so to speak, and that consistency that I mentioned, but also the need for a single set of tools that is diverse enough to be able to handle not only what the applications a company has today, but also kind of future-proof them, right? We don't want to have separate compliance systems that also don't talk to each other and don't integrate, because that cross-system, that entire landscape analysis is so, so important. Now, really focusing and understanding and having those consistent processes is really going to win the race for customers, meaning that understanding risk tolerance, understanding security approaches, understanding security design methodologies, although you're dealing with diverse systems, applying that to those diverse systems and having that consistency, I think is absolutely essential. I always cringe when I walk into an organization and they say, hey, you know what? Our finance system, it's rock solid, very secure. We pass our audits, but procurement over there, not so much. We have a lot of work to do. Well, that means you're not following consistent processes, right? I'm glad you're identifying that, yes, you have a weakness there, but it's now applying the same rules, the same effort, the same philosophies, the same tools to all of those different applications, because we don't want to have a weak player when it comes to an app and when it comes to security as well. I noticed that we got a Q&A question that came up from Bernice. How can granular security approach be implemented to protect internal systems when employees frequently use their personal phones or for accessing applications? Jason, maybe I'll throw that to you if you want to talk about that, because that really first line of defense is a good step there. And then I can talk about maybe once they're in and some of the granularity of the security after that.
Yeah, so for the most part, the mobile layer is a UI layer. The transactions and the access still live inside the application on the back end. And whether that's on-premise or that's cloud, it doesn't really matter where it lives. But typically the mobile application is just the UI layer. But all of the actions happening in the end device, can be controlled by end device security solutions. And when you're also looking at the authentication of those mobile applications, things like biometrics, whether it's, your SSO providers, you can always have that front door being locked to make sure that you're using that mobile app for that application. But what's really key is you want to make sure that the access that user has as they're using it through the UI layer of that mobile app is either least privileged by design, or maybe it's zero standing privileges where there's an elevation of access for a certain amount of time to do some work that's not typically the person's responsibility to do that. But really, securing the mobile layer with device management, SSO, authentication is one step. The second step is, all of that transactions that are occurring through that mobile layer is still happening on the back end database of those applications. And you want to make sure that they can only perform what access they have access to with the standing privileges, or firefighter elevate their access for a certain amount of time. And all of those transactions, if you are elevating, whether it's elevated access management, firefighter, break glass, it's known by a bunch of different things, the activities the person did with that elevated privilege is in a log someplace in that application. How you tease that information out of that log and get it into a reviewable state, that's something that is commonly known as firefighter and SAP parlance, or privileged access management. It's just-in-time elevation of access, but then knowing what they did is very key in the audit process to make sure that while they had the elevated access, they didn't use it in combination with other access they already had to commit fraud, right? So, Bernice, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but there's multiple approaches to having these applications on your phone as a UI layer into the underlying database and the transactions that are occurring there.
Right. And Jason, I'd give you a high five if we were in the same room. I love your comment at the end there about the monitoring. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should or you are doing it, right? And really making sure that you're limiting what people can do and then monitoring what they're actually doing with it if they can do something is so interesting for me. And usually a gap that isn't getting done at a lot of organizations. They just focus on what a person can do rather than what they're actually doing. And especially if you're wanting to be efficient with your resources and not fighting fires, but being proactive, really bringing in that reality of execution is so important when it comes to monitoring.
Actually, we have a few more questions popping in. Let's go to the last slide of the solution, and then we'll get to, I think, Douglas and Oliver's questions after this real quick. So the solution, is there an easy button? Is that a Home Depot office mat? I don't know what it is. The easy button. I don't think anybody who's practiced application GRC, continuous controls monitoring, access governance, we all know there is no easy button. It does require some thought, process, people, assessments that we talked about. But as you think about, traditional identity management, identity governance, and the automation of access, that's the operational IT efficiencies, cost control. But the next step is the application governance and the continuous monitoring of that access, right? And so I already said I kind of moved from that monolithic stack to multiple hybrid on-prem cloud, different vendors. And in order to get a full picture of different business functions across the applications, you need to bring in the access into one pane of glass to make sure that somebody doesn't have toxic combinations of access that would allow them to create fraud. But not just the possibility of that access, but to your point, James, is did they do something? Did they execute the access they had to commit that fraud? And that kind of dovetails into the whole continuous controls monitoring. So we talked about on the very beginning, continuous authentication on the front door, but continuously monitoring compliance and what people are doing with it. Super important because it allows businesses to quantify the potential ramifications of revenue. And when I started out in just pure IT, user ID and passwords, I was always asking myself, I was being told by my business leaders, my CFO, how is what you do helping us make money or prevent us from losing money? And I always struggled with that in my early days, with that. I knew the operational IT efficiencies I was helping the business with, but quantifying the risk financially is something that in my maturation came to appreciate greatly. So I'm curious, do you see the same kind of journey that you see your clients take on their maturity model as well? And how do they address it?
Yeah. Jamie, do you want this one or shall I?
Sure. Yeah. So we talked about the centralized system, the expansion. Here's a little bit of industry feedback. We used to have customers ask us for a 2-year roadmap. Now we're having them ask us for help with a 5-year roadmap. And there's a bit of resetting going on, which James and I are finding super interesting. It is, we're moving, we may be moving to the cloud, or we have many different systems, and we're adding on through various things, acquisitions, regionally, expansion in general. But we used to get the rolling of the eyes when we would talk about a 5-year plan. But Jason, they want help saying, if we need to reset, let's reset it now, because we've got so many things we're going to be doing over the next 5-year period. And we want the guidance to say, is this foundation that you're going to help us reset, is that going to be sustainable in the future? So we're seeing a lot of that. In the process, we're explaining a lot about what you're talking about, the importance of each of the components that go into a centralized system, and defining those processes, having your business operate fully on those processes, and then the ownership and accountability side of that falls into place and is extremely important in that. So James, I'll pass it to you for add on to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I have the great opportunity at speaking at a lot of security and GRC conferences around the world, and I have a topic. It's called the evolution of a GRC customer. And Jason, you kind of kicked me off, and I could speak hours on this topic because I'm so passionate about it. I promise I won't. But really, you nailed it. There isn't that easy button. It is an evolution, right? And you have to get your house in order, say, for instance, in a single system before you can start talking about multiple systems and cross system, et cetera. And it's kind of little baby steps. And figuring out where you are in that evolution as a GRC customer is absolutely essential, because it tells you not only, hey, this is what we need, but also where we'd like to get to, and what are those baby steps, like Jamie was alluding to, in that 5-year plan versus a 2-year plan, and what it's going to take to get there, and resources. Now, things are getting harder too at the same time. And I alluded to this before, and I think it's worth stating it again. When I first started as an auditor, we used to do spot checking. We used to do random sampling, right? Because we didn't have the wherewithal, the capability, the time to be able to look at all transactions for a large data set and be able to run through them. And that was satisfactory back in the day. Well, if you take a sample of 10 out of 1,000, it's like playing the lottery. Are you going to actually pick up that fraud? Are you actually going to pick up that issue in that small data sample that you did? And that no longer cuts it. And having applications such as Pathlock that is, allowing you to not only have reporting, but reporting on volume and scale. And the tool is able to not just be a stupid human like me, but have the wherewithal to analyze everything, not just that random sample, is so important. And getting a customer up to that level takes some time, and that's part of that evolution I alluded to. And a critical part of that evolution is making sure you have the right products and applications and tools to be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish.
One of my recent favorite movies, titled Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, Big Bang, I guess. I've seen customers try to do everything and get all access to all things, in a very short amount of time. And there's very little priority or prioritization of which applications present the most risk to the organization. So I've also seen success in having risk tiers of your applications. There's one thing to put an application into a tier of automating access to it because 100% of their population has access to it. But just because your most critical, financially critical application has maybe 10% of your users, that could significantly hurt the bottom line of an organization. You have to look at both factors. So start with your most critical applications, and then on that maturation curve, look at continuous controls monitoring, transaction data. I mean, the amount of data for transaction monitoring is pretty large and hefty, right? But bringing that in, I look at akin to a SIM solution, syslogs. You're putting in all this data, terabytes of data from syslogs. You're writing correlation rules. Then you look for pattern matches, maybe some behavior analytics. It's a perfect use case for some machine learning, maybe even some large language models, AI. Because to your point, sample testing gets you so far, and no one human can look through everything. So as we look to the future of how do we make it more valuable to organizations, leveraging things like this, pattern matching, behavior analytics, and machine learning, I think that's the future to help quicker on that journey from everything all at once to let's spread it out, but let's compress that journey to provide real business value and outcomes. And some of those outcomes is reduce your cybersecurity insurance, right? Your brand reputation, as you said, because nobody wants to report that unless they have to. So those are just some of the things that we're seeing at Pathlock, helping. We also contribute to some cyber controls in the SAP world with OWASP, top 10. So the Foundation Core Business Application Project, we're helping partner with there as well. So just a few things that Pathlock is doing to solve these issues we've talked about today. Any parting thoughts before we get to the questions from Douglas and Oliver?
The biggest one for me, and this dovetails into the evolution of a GRC customer, is don't try to boil the ocean and don't get frustrated along the way or overwhelmed. A lot of customers see this as being a large journey, a ton of work. And yeah, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, it is, but one step at a time, one foot in front of the other to get where you're going. And as Jason alluded to a second ago, accelerating that journey, making sure that you are using your resources to the most efficient mechanism, so you can get to that finish line is absolutely essential. Making sure that you're consistent in your security processes, not just for one system, but all your systems is also good. Prioritization as well, which Jason, you alluded to, is fundamental, and it goes hand in hand with that consistency that I mentioned. So
I would just add quick, my parting thought is what I mentioned earlier. Why are we doing this? As customers ask us, and we say we're not there just to placate a particular group within the organization. It's the right thing to do to automate your systems, remove the manual components of it, reduce errors with that, and it's the right thing to do for a business. It's efficiencies, and it makes your workforce a little bit better at focusing on the right thing. So thank you for that, Jason.
Yeah, and just when you got to that point in your program where you're pretty happy, you decided to go out and acquire another company who has a totally different ERP solution. And you kind of, so it is a program, it is continuous program to make sure that you have security and governance across your most critical applications. Well, thank you, Jamie. A couple questions. Let's see, I think there's a couple here. Douglas Murphy, how do you explain to management the risks and need for integrating SOD analysis to components like BTP or programs with direct access to the HANA database underneath the S4 system? What's the business case there? How have you advised your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's basically, to summarize, Douglas, what you're saying is, how do I make them care? And that's a hard task to do. The approach that I always follow myself and recommend to customers is it's the submarine scenario. You can have a steel door in the front of the submarine, but if you have a screen door in the back, it's still going to let in water. And taking the emotion out of it. I always hate the scare tactics that people try to convince management with, is if you don't do this, this will happen. But really taking it down to the facts to say, you know what, these are the critical functions that are executed within B2P or within our HANA database directly, okay? Are you okay now that I've articulated and had you understand what the risk is? And if they still sign off on it, well, it is what it is. Then you can start building a mitigation control process around it. But usually what I find in reality is when you truly lay out the facts, when you say, okay, these are the capabilities, these are the risks, this is what could happen, and maybe even supplementing it with factual information out of GRC or Pathlock, et cetera, to say, this is the frequency that this risk happens within our organization. It's very rare that management would not get it and not support something like putting a steel door in that second submarine, or the second door of the submarine, rather than having that screen door. But once again, my approach is not the fear factor. The fear factor, I think, is used too much, but it's really articulating the facts, explaining things to a level that whoever the decision maker is understands what the risk is, and usually it will become common sense. If it doesn't, you can always resort to getting your audit team involved and allowing them to also carry a bigger stick when it comes to explaining what the risk is within the organization. But I usually like to use that as a part 2 if part 1 didn't work.
Right. And a question from Oliver asking about what tool Pathlock offers to manage efficiently business profiles in a very heterogeneous, complex SAP environment based on company organizational structure, or do you have an AI approach? So Pathlock does offer a native solution within the SAP ecosystem to look at designing or redesigning the role structure, the business role structure, and even the technical single composite roles. And a safe way to transition from the old role design to the new role design without a big bang approach. You can always revert back, to your old role model if the new role model happens to break some of your business processes. So yeah, as you are in that journey from R3 to S4 and other SAP applications, whether it be Ariba, Concur, SuccessFactors, etc., there is capabilities to look at designing roles within that ecosystem, and even across non-SAP applications, whether it be Oracle EBS responsibilities, which is their word for roles. Then you have their menu, submenu, and privileges. So whether it's Oracle EBS or Oracle ERP Cloud, PeopleSoft, Workday, we do have the ability to wrap enterprise or business role structure around the different ERPs out there. And Brian has one last question. Do you find the sponsor ownership changing from the IT org over to the risk org? I'm going to hand that over to James and Jamie. You probably see it firsthand as you have a relationship long-term with your clients. My quick answer is, I think it depends on how large an organization is and how they silo different business functions within it. But I'll leave it best to the pros.
It's also a dream of mine. It's where we want to go, but how fast we're getting there is probably the question. So Brian, to align with what Jason mentioned, not only size, but also how progressive an organization is. Yes, we definitely want to have that ownership shift to a risk organization and also more of a functional business organization as well, right? Back in the day, and Brian, you and I know each other, actually. You have a similar background as well and experience in the industry. We saw that, security, well, that's IT. Security, that's even basis back in the old days before you even had dedicated security organizations to take it over. And it's taken a long time to kind of progress and move that needle over to say, hey, this is not just an IT problem. This is not just an IT area of accountability. It involves, functional people. It involves our auditors, and potentially stimulates the need for building a dedicated risk component of your organization. And that's, of course, the holy grail where we want to push that needle. Is it getting better? Absolutely. Back in the day when we would even suggest that, hey, this isn't IT, this is business, people would cringe and you know, kind of scoff at it and saying, oh, we'll never be able to make that happen. You know, they don't care. They don't have the knowledge, you know, all those different excuses. And we used to have to pull people to start thinking a different way, that this is not just an IT problem. And that's getting better, which is great, but it's still not moving at an accelerated rate to what I'd like to see. And one thing that we strive and assist customers with is kind of building those teams, bringing that awareness. And this even ties back to Doug's question a few minutes ago, who also I know, thank you, Doug, for that question, is about how do I make people understand, right? Not just giving them the responsibility saying, hey, now you're part of this team, you better worry about this, but it's really bringing their knowledge level up to the reason why we're worrying about it, right? What are the ramifications and potential impacts to our organization? And like I said, once you start using those type of common sense, fact-based type of scenarios, then, you know, that helps with that evolution of moving it out of this is a technical problem to more of, hey, we need to get the right people involved within our company. And Jamie, I'll throw it to you because I know you have some passion on this topic too.
Absolutely. You know, to add to what James is saying, we're seeing the collaboration between the two main groups increase. We help that. Pathlock helps that with, you know, basically materializing what is going on and actually putting it into real terms. But we do see a big uptick in the collaboration between the groups. And my personal opinion is that is because it's becoming even higher level, which is the C level, and it's being pushed top down. So we are able to, as James mentioned, come in and help articulate that key component and integrate those other team members as they're needed in a large scale project. But the good news is we're seeing good movement. We're seeing strong, I don't want to say it's territorial, but we are seeing that it is moving forward and it's a better collaborative environment now.
I think that's the last question we had on the screen, and I think we're getting close to time. So I did flash up some you know, slides of both how you can get a hold of Pathlock and myself, as well as Customer Advisory Group, James and Jamie. Stephanie, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that you can go to our website at pathlock.com for any more information, and reach out to us at info@pathlock.com, or you can contact Jason at his contact info. You can also reach out to James and Jamie at their info here. And we already went over questions, so I'll skip over that. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you at future discussions.
And thank you so much, James and Jamie. Greatly appreciate the conversation, and hope that this helped get some context to everybody's journey in this world of application GRC. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason and Stephanie. It's our pleasure.
All right, I'll end the webcast. And I just want to point out to any attendees that want the CPE credit, go ahead and click on the help us get your CPE credit information that you'll see on your control panel, and you can fill out your information there. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.